Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Now, you might see this as flogging a dead horse, because I already touched on this a couple of days ago, but I have to speak on this. But first, a little primer. You remember the case of former California Superior Court Judge Aaron Persky? He was the judge who presided over the infamous Brock Turner rape trial. Brock Turner rapes a young woman, and that judge not only gave Turner 6-month sentence, which only amounted to 3 months in actual jail, but this Persky character had the gall to sit in open court and white-splain that he refused to give Turner the sentence he deserved because he didn't want to ruin Brock Turner's life. He deliberately said not even one word about the young woman who Turner had raped. He made it a point to ignore her. All he talked about was the letters of support that were written for Turner, and how Turner had no prior convictions. He made sure to use the word convictions because Turner had been caught using drugs, even on video. But this judge wasn't delivering a ruling, he was making an editorial from the bench. After this total travesty, people felt helpless, but there was one person who decided to do something about Judge Persky, Stanford law professor Michelle Dauber. She was the one who led the effort to have Persky recalled. She also educated the public on how Persky had demanded higher bail amounts and handed down harsher sentences against non-white men who had been accused of rape in his court, under similar circumstances to Turner. So clearly Persky was operating with an open bias, but you wouldn't hear the white media saying much about that. Now, this was a white woman who did this, and that's what made it particularly dangerous. You can't have white people helping to attack white privilege. And so the white media went into phony hysterics about Persky being recalled, about how judges will now be terrified to give lenient sentences, even in cases where it's appropriate because of the recall. Never mind that the white media had been defending Persky's ruling the whole time, saying that it was legal and appropriate. The bastards at NBC, which stands for nothing but Caucasians, tried to hide behind so-called minorities as their defense of Persky. You can't recall Persky, they said. This will make it where judges will hand down draconian sentences to minorities, read black defendants. As if judges aren't already doing that now and haven't been doing it all along. Black people get the harshest sentences no matter what, regardless of the facts or what the law actually calls for. So the white media's pathetic tactic fell flat. You can't threaten black people with something that you're already doing. Black people had nothing to do with the Brock Turner fiasco. This was a white man who raped a Eurasian woman and a white judge who let him go. Black people were no part of that equation. This was the white media demanding white immunity from law, particularly the blatant legal immunity automatically given to those classified as white, be maintained at all costs. This was a demand to maintain a racial status quo. That's why the white media came out across the board to attack Michelle Dauber. None of them defended her. None of them were cheerleading for harsher laws either. In other words, they didn't act the same way they did whenever talking about a black celebrity. See, the terror that the white media and the white establishment felt over the recall of Persky was that the judicial immunity that white privilege requires was coming under attack. If judges get scared that maintaining genetic immunity from law will cost them their careers and their futures, then who will allow white privilege in court? That's what's at stake. But of course, they couldn't say that outright. But they didn't have to. Everyone understood exactly what this was about. Now, that was in 2019. Since then, there's been a satanic parade of perversely light sentences given to people who were caught on video committing murders. They've continued to give light sentences to convicted criminals without skipping a beat. Hell, earlier this year you had the case of Drew Clinton, who had been found guilty of felony sexual assault after he put a pillow over a 16-year-old girl's face and raped her. You'll recall that Clinton asked for a bench trial, which means he forfeited his right to a jury and instead asked the judge to be the sole arbiter of the case. The judge found him guilty of criminal sexual assault, but then when it came time to sentence Clinton, the judge suddenly reversed his own decision and said that he refused to give Clinton the mandatory 4 years in prison required under Illinois law, even though, as the judge himself admitted, that's what the law said and it was what he was supposed to do. Instead, the judge threw out his own verdict because he didn't like the law. He said that what the law required wasn't just. He actually said that, by the way. This judge said in open court that justice isn't what the law says, justice is what the judge says. And the judge's justice wasn't based on the law, it was based on his personal feelings. But he didn't stop there. He went on to declare that he was deliberately subverting the law, that he was going to tell a lie just to engineer an outcome that he wanted. I mean, he was bold about it. He said that he knew if he declared the sentence to be unconstitutional, then the verdict would simply be reversed on appeal, because the sentence is mandatory by law. So instead, he said he would just declare that the people hadn't proven their case. Now, obviously, he didn't believe that at all. He was the judge who found Clinton guilty. So he believed that the people did make their case. He just didn't want to have to reject genetic immunity from law. And this judge tried to defend and sanitize his illegality by saying that, well, Drew Clinton has already been in county jail for 5 months already, and well, that's enough time, and after all, we don't want to ruin this young man's life. Gee, where have we heard that before? That was earlier this year, and as you see, the same New York Times who was trying to scare people that judges would be terrified not to hand down harsh sentences anymore, they were real quiet on that Drew Clinton trial, especially the reversal. The same NBC and New York Times who were lecturing us that Judge Persky's sentence was within the bounds of the law, and that if people didn't like the rulings, well, they need to demand changes to the law because the law was the problem. Well, in Illinois, with Drew Clinton, the sentence is mandatory, and yet the judge, under the same circumstances as Brock Turner, just threw out his own verdict because he didn't like the law. So obviously the law isn't the problem. The problem is the judges, who clearly have an understanding that there's certain people who the law is supposed to apply to, black, and then there's other people who the law is never supposed to apply to. So here we are 3 years after Brock Turner, 3 years after Aaron Persky was recalled, and I'm still waiting to see at what point are these judges going to get scared of the public backlash. When will these judges finally begin handing down the constant torrent of harsh sentences like the white media told us they were going to do? Here we are 3 years after Aaron Persky's recall, and the judges are making a grotesque show out of giving pitifully low sentences to certain offenders, and making a show out of giving total disrespect to the victims of the crimes and complete sympathy and support to the people who they know are guilty. And they're daring the public to do anything about it. Now, I told you earlier this week about how one of the murderers of George Floyd was given a slap on the wrist by that federal judge who, just like former Judge Persky, went on and on about how he got 145 letters of support for this accomplice in murder, and like Persky, this federal judge, a creep named Magnuson, didn't say a word about George Floyd. You better recognize when these judges are making a show out of their contempt for these victims. So this same judge was also the one supposed to be sentencing the 2 remaining murderers of George Floyd, and he gave them a sentence of 3.5 years and 3 years respectively. That's only slightly longer than the 2.5 years that he gave to the other killer who had a plea deal earlier this week. And when this Magnuson character gave that light sentence earlier this week, he tried to defend it by saying that, well, that Lane guy, his plea deal meant that he took some measure of responsibility and he showed remorse. Well, these other 2 didn't do either one of those things. And yet this judge gave them almost exactly the same light sentence. So my point is that these rulings are not based on law. It's classic I'm white and I say so. These judges are attempting to impose their own illegal maximum sentence for capital offenses, one that is the opposite of what the law says. Now, these judges who deliberately give these slap-on-the-wrist sentences and give open support in court to people who kill black folks, it's meant to be an insult, yes, but more than that, they do it as a form of direct challenge to the lives and safety of the black community. This is a federal judge in this case sending a message that the federal government will refuse to punish anyone who murders a black person, that if some white supremacist murders a black person, then the courts are going to take the side of the killers. This was meant to be an unambiguous statement of support and encouragement to murder black people. That's what this is. These are not judicial rulings at all. They are personal and political statements by corrupt bureaucrats. These judges use these rulings as their way to spit in the faces of people and groups they don't like. As they see it, the attention will be on the defendant, so the judge can hide behind that and say, well, it's the law, you see. And even if the law is not able to be used, they say, well, it ain't justice and I'm not the defendant, and the white media is going to tell all of you, you can't get mad at me. I'm not the defendant, I'm just the judge. Well, people are wisely drawing no distinction between the criminal who commits the offense and these judges who abuse their position to try to support them after the fact. But what's called for here is to put teeth behind the indignation. Unless the criminals in the courtroom who pervert the course of justice are actually made to suffer consequences for their behavior, then they have no incentive to stop. And the punishment has to come from the public themselves. The judges know that the state bar and so-called judicial oversight groups aren't going to touch them, so the public must make certain that these judges are held to account. Aaron Persky, for example, is still suffering the results of his decision to ignore the law. He basically is unemployable in the legal field now. Ironic, since the clown used to be a prosecutor. But there's no DA's office in America that will hire Aaron Persky. Besides, judges don't demote themselves by stepping down a rung on the ladder to being prosecutors or defense attorneys. So Persky, now unable to get a job as a paralegal, had tried to get a job in a school as a tennis coach for a girls' tennis team. I'm not making that up. So he goes out of his way to allow a rapist to go unpunished, and then makes it a point to totally ignore the victim during his remarks, and then he tries to go and be a coach for girls. Now, when this came to the public's attention, the school district that tried to hire Aaron Persky initially attempted to defend that decision. But the public rallied, and literally the very next day they announced, on second thought, Aaron Persky is gone. The cover story that the school district tried to use was that they didn't want the negative media attention that Aaron Persky would bring, but considering that they publicly defended their decision to hire him, obviously media attention didn't matter to them at all. The truth was that the public wasn't letting Aaron Persky go. They weren't forgetting about him, and they weren't allowing him to just move on. The public had proven they could get Persky recalled, and if the public had enough will, focus, and determination to remove a judge, then they could also summon enough will, focus, and determination to remove those school board members too. That was what made them drop the bastard. Now, I'm not sure what's become of Persky since, and I suppose to an extent it doesn't matter. He didn't get the punishment he deserved, but it was poetic justice that because he refused to hand down the rightful punishment of a rapist, Aaron Persky was the one who wound up being punished for the rest of his life. The lesson to take away from the Persky recall is that there is no substitute for punishing judges who violate the law. That's what's called for. When you have trash like that Judge Chu, who gave Kim Potter basically no prison time at all, going so far as to pretend to cry in court, just make a real show that she's sympathetic with the murderer, and demanding, not asking, but demanding that the public empathize with the murderer, you know you got somebody who needs to be punished. This while Potter was staring daggers at the white jury that convicted her, by the way. Oh, and on a side note, only a couple of months after her illegal ruling, former Judge Chu announced that she's retiring. We all know that's bullcrap. The heifer is jumping instead of waiting to get pushed. But just because this creep isn't on the bench doesn't mean she can't get punished. Not at all. The public has a number of options available to it, as was demonstrated with Aaron Persky. Running these corrupt bastards off the bench is just the beginning of the punishments that can be leveraged against them. Chu and these other corrupt judges, they're testing the public's will right now. They want to see, will consequences attach to their illegal behavior, or was Aaron Persky just a one-off? That's what they're doing. They're rolling the dice. They're gambling. All of these judges in America, they all saw what happened with the police in 2020. They know that the public can punish them even though they're judges, but they're testing to see if the public will punish them. The apparatuses that the white media and the authorities keep telling us are supposed to check and punish judicial misconduct clearly don't work. The public cannot and should not just be helpless victims of corrupt judges. Judges are not above the law, and when the bureaucracy refuses to hold judges accountable, then the public has to step in and make sure that justice is done. A system that refuses to hold so-called authorities to account is not a system at all. It's just a gang of bandits. You cannot call a judicial ruling justice when it's just a slap on the wrist. The public knows the difference between when the law is being upheld and when it's being ignored. We have trials, verdicts, and rulings every single day, so we know what's normal and what's not. The lie about how difficult it is to convict the police died a quick and grisly death the last several years, so the police's immunity from law is gone. But now comes the other part of the job, to make sure that the bastards get the punishment they deserve. The judges are, as I've told you, attempting to act as some half-assed last ditch for these scumbags. We gotta make sure that that ditch falls. They're taking a calculated risk, the same risk that Aaron Persky took. That the public will be mad, but ultimately they'll move on or get bored or forget or become apathetic and decide that there's ultimately nothing they can do. They're hoping that the public doesn't have the will. And the punishment cannot be some administrative penalty, by the way. It has to be severe and life-changing, like what happened to Aaron Persky. Judge Chu, Judge Magnus, and all these creeps in the courtroom who have perverted the course of justice have to be held accountable to the public's satisfaction. Justice isn't merely putting someone on trial. That's just an administrative process. Justice is one thing and one thing only: adequate punishment for the crime. If you don't have adequate punishment for the crime, then you don't have justice. And that must include not only the perpetrators of the crime, but a clear recognition by the public of the obvious, that these judges are acting as accomplices after the fact. And these judges who want to be what amounts to accessories to the crimes, they're volunteering to be punished as well. If the public makes it clear that they will attach punishment to these illegal and criminal rulings by these judges, then they will stop. The public has proven that they've got the power to punish these corrupt and racist judges. The public certainly has the right to punish these judges. The only question is, does the public also have the will to? Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: James Wright, Asha Mwamba, Ikigas Dorset, Wendell, and Jubal England. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.